Hello and welcome to this week's Aiding Your Game. This week we're continuing from last week talking about dragons as we get closer and closer to the launch of Fizzbin's Treasury of Dragons. Now before we start this video, please make sure you go down and hit that subscribe button. If you don't mind getting the notifications, be sure to hit that bell. Give us a thumbs up if you like the content. Leave a comment down below of content you'd like for us to present here on our channel. Now, as we talked about last week, dragons being a part of Dungeons & Dragons just makes sense. I highly recommend introducing dragons early on in your adventures and using them as regular staples to the foils that your parties have to overcome. If you're a GM, there are a lot of great ways that you can incorporate dragons into your gaming world. While several of the adventures that Wizards of the Coast publishes for 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons do feature dragons, if you have your own homebrew campaigns or your own homebrew session one-shots that you're playing, incorporating dragons doesn't have to be super difficult. Also, you don't want it just to be a monster of the week type of encounter. The more depth you put into your dragons, just as you would your storytelling, the villains and NPCs that you're populating your world with, the dragons that you put into your gaming world could have major impacts not only to the party, but the environment alone. In the Monster Manual, it talks about the landscape changing when a dragon's lair is in the area. It gives depth and detail into what those changes or what that landscape is, and when the dragon is defeated or driven off, the changes that occur to get it back to the way it was prior to the dragon creating a lair. But looking at the dragons and really figuring out how to feature dragons in your D&D game can be a lot of fun. Though it can also be a little bit of work, the fun really outweighs it in my opinion. Now, I have 2 campaigns that feature dragons pretty prominently. One of them is The Last Light, and in that campaign, the players can choose basically one of 3 paths to pursue: defeating the demons and devils, defeating the lich and undead, or defeating the dragons. Most players generally go after the dragons just because they are an iconic monster for them to work against and really have to overcome. So I've played more times in that campaign against dragons, or having the players play against dragons, than the undead hordes and the devil and demon elements. Regardless, it's all a lot of fun, but the dragons, changing it up and really driving why they're there and how they're impacting the story and the character's motivation, really drove home to me the importance of thinking about your dragons as villains or even accomplices to your PCs at a greater level of detail. For instance, with that campaign, it's designed to go from 5th to 10th level. So 2 of the dragons that the party encounter are actually wormlings, and they're easy to overcome to a tactical aspect of it. But the story behind, for players who are looking for story threads and deeper dives into the story of the campaign, all of the dragons that are featured, which are chromatic, a white, a green, a blue, a red, and a black, were hatched for specific reasons that encompass the overall story arc. The dragons are creatures who are trying to really become the dragons they intend to become in their life. However, there is a cult or villains who are trying to control them and use the dragons for their own ends. So there is an underlying story of, are the dragons capable of overcoming and not surrendering what they are to the primary villains? While the dragons are villainous, they are chromatic, they are evil, they do have their own plots and everything. For the player characters, kind of piecing the threads together is really interesting. The dragons in the story have motivations of their own. So there are other parties who are trying to collect the dragons and actually make them servants to the villains in the campaign. The dragons are also out with their own evil plans. The wormlings are both looking to create their own layers, their own regions. One of them, whichever one happens to be kind of the forefront piece, the first one they go after, has actually kind of escaped or worked against the villain who is trying to control it and is really out to create their own lair. So when the adventurers come in, they're, depending on which dragon it is, either the white or the green. The white is more just trying to get its space, destroy anything that comes near it, and really stamp its own bestiality out against this party of adventurers who feel foolish enough to come after it. The green is a little more tricky and will try to use the characters by giving them information and make them his own pawns. Even though it's a wormling, the stats in the book still show they're very intelligent, they're crafty, they're creative, and you have to think about the dragons, how you're using them in your environment. In this case, the green and the white are still just trying to learn what they are and create an environment of their own. Both of them are out of their element, so the attempts they're trying to make to create a lair are challenging for them and actually give an opportunity for the players to have kind of an upper hand with them. And that's by design, by GM design, just because the dragons are villainous, they are chromatic, and the goal of the story is for the party to confront and ultimately either destroy or drive off the dragons, get them off of the side of the primary villain who is trying to control them. Now with the young dragon, which is the blue in this case, generally based on how the story goes, it's already started to escape and find its own place, which isn't on the material plane. It's also kind of happy to let the party face some other villains and leave it alone so that it can grow. And ultimately, this is by design again, because blue dragons are pretty smart as well. They want to kind of let the adventurers feel happy to have overcome some other evil and then come back in the end as a larger villain after they've had a little bit of time to grow and develop and hone their skills. They'll still remember that slight that the adventurers put on them, but generally the players are happy not to tangle with that young blue dragon. Now, sometimes they do feel confident and go after that dragon, and at which point it's up to the dice, because I really don't pull punches very often, and I tend to run more gritty campaigns, so the characters definitely know they have to really work as a team to overcome this obstacle. Usually by that point they've got the experience levels to be able to handle one adult dragon, especially because it's not in its own environment. It does not have layer actions. It does not have those capabilities that generally would be more deadly to a adventuring party at that level. But it's pretty interesting to see kind of how the players react, and if they let the dragon live, when it comes back, that kind of a gotcha moment where they slap where they ultimately decide, man, we should have taken on that dragon. And it's just a fun opportunity. Now with the adult dragons that I use, a red and a black, those ones both have kind of two ends of the spectrum. One of them is already being controlled by a villain, one of them is not. Depending on how they go after these dragons and what order they go after them, because it is a more sandbox setting, the red dragon is a typical red dragon. Also, because it is controlled, it does not have a lair. This allows my player characters to be able to take on a red dragon and have an opportunity, if they work strategically and as a team, to overcome an adult red dragon. Now, it is a very challenging task. They have to make sure that they really think about it, but there is an opportunity for them. Generally, by this point, my players are fairly high in level, and they are able to really think strategically, and they know how they play their characters very well, so the characters themselves can overcome this challenge. Also, because the red dragon does not yet have its lair, it does not have minions, and it can be kind of a one-shot fight. So there is a good reason for them to be able to take on this dragon and really defeat it or drive it away without it breaking the story or immersion. And generally, most of the players really tend to leave the black dragon until the very end. It's the second to last dragon that they fight, the last being a Draco Lich at 10th level. But the party themselves, when they're taking on a black dragon, there is a big opportunity to really pull out all the stops. The black dragon, because it's generally left until last, always has a lair. And even if they go after it beforehand, sometimes they have to pull away or really take on a deadly encounter. But the black dragon in this campaign of The Last Light has an established lair. Now, the lair itself has an effect that has changed a lot of the environment, and that's what brought the black dragon to this location. Again, part of the story. The dragon was drawn to this place and does not want to leave, and intruders into this area do suffer some effects, and they ultimately find a element of the story that, unless they have done a lot of early research, really diving in, surprises a lot of the players. The opportunity to change things up and move away from the monster manual I really employ in my black dragon because of the element that has drawn the black dragon to the location to establish its lair. It does have full lair effects, but additionally, because of the element that's in the story, I'm able to homebrew a little bit and change it up. So the players are surprised and really not prepared for the encounter. This really drives home the effect that I should have done my homework before coming in a lot of cases. Also, it allows me to make the dragon a stronger part of the ongoing story, the overarching story of this campaign, which ultimately is what draws the players, whichever of the three paths they choose, to the conclusion of the campaign, and really allows them to become the heroes of this region. I bring a lot of this up because as we're talking about dragons, while dragons are really cool and should be a part of the game and fantastic creatures to be able to play with as a GM, fantastic creatures to overcome as player characters, the biggest thing is not just having it be a monster of the week. Look at ways that you can evolve your storytelling to include dragons and really drive home the piece that dictates why they're there. What is their impact on the story? How does it tie into your overarching story elements? What are the effects that it's got on the region? A dragon as a fantastic mythical creature should not just be a monster of the week. They're cunning, they're smart, they're evil. For the chromatics, the metallics, of course, are good. Whenever you decide to incorporate dragons into your games, really as a GM, if you're not spending time thinking about why they're there, how they affect the area around them, how they interact with your story, and what they mean to your story elements, you're really doing a disservice to yourself and your players and the story as a whole. Really spend some time and think about how these dragons or dragons in your game came to be, why they're there, why they're opponents to the PC, and ultimately what overthrowing these elements or driving them off or dealing with the dragons really means to your game world. Spending that amount of time thinking about dragons and really diving into them as an element of your story can really help immersion for your players, just because it's a bigger impact and has higher stakes than just a rat hunt below a tavern. Let's talk about story elements to bring your dragons into the games. We'll go with just red dragons, just because they're the most iconic. Wormlings are great for low-level encounters. The red dragon has a CR of 4, meaning a party of 4 4th-level adventurers should find them a challenging encounter, but not deadly. So it's one of 6 good encounters for a day of adventure for a party of 4. Now, looking at the stats, they've definitely got good armor and hit points, and they've got decent movement with 30 feet of movement, climbing 30 feet, and flying of 60. They're super strong with a 19 strength, 17 constitution, and they're more intelligent than a common human with a 12 intelligence. They're also pretty charismatic. Thinking about this, you should start to put together that they can go toe-to-toe with your frontline fighters and hold their own for a little bit. This will negate ranged attacks and area of effect spells, so a good opponent. One thing to think about is how to incorporate them into your game. If you're doing an urban campaign, let's say, perhaps a merchant is smuggling these young dragons and one escaped, or maybe a pair if you've got more party members. Thinking about how did they get to where they've gotten to and why the player should confront them. In our quick example, maybe the merchant wants to hire the party to catch and destroy the dragons so that they're not found out and taxed by the local government for smuggling dragon wormlings. Maybe if you've got more of a wilderness encounter, a wormling is trying to come in and establish a lair. Whatever the case may be, think about why this dragon is where it is, especially for lower level adventurers. Now when you start getting into young dragons, they're larger in size, so you have to think about that. They also have a little bit higher armor class, much higher hit points. They're faster, 40 feet movement, 40-foot climbing speed, and flying of 80 feet. Look at their strength, 23, constitution of 21, and very intelligent. Also super charismatic. They also have good perception, so should be more challenging for the party to come upon them. One thing to think about is with their challenge rating set at 10, that means your player character should be level 10 if you've got 4 of them. However, remember, CR ratings are set for an average of 6 per day. So if you put more encounters in, you definitely want them to be higher level. But if you take some of the encounters out, then it could be just a more deadly encounter for lower level, 5th or 6th level party of 4. And it is still doable, especially if they hire an NPC to assist. One thing to think about is with their multi-attacks, they do have an opportunity still to go toe-to-toe with your frontline fighters and move out of range or make area of effect spells less effective for your casters. Definitely opportunities to introduce them into a story need to be thought about, because why would a young dragon be there? Well, it could just be looking for a location to start a lair. It may not have its lair effects yet. So this is a good way for them to move in and start terrorizing a populace. You could really start laying the seeds of this early on in the campaign with things like missing sheep from the fields or anything like that, to start laying the seeds that there's something somewhere that needs to be dealt with. It doesn't have to be the first thing that your adventuring party has to confront, but lay the seeds so that they know that there's something out there, and then spring it on them. It's a dragon. As you start getting into adult dragons, these should not be left for lower level parties. Definitely sprinkle the seeds in, whatever the current campaign setting is, whether it's urban, whether it's on the frontier, whether it's at sea. There should be rumors and stories here and there that pop up about some type of a winged terror that attacks, and should be a culmination. This should be a point where your party is looking for a more climactic battle. Slaying the red dragon that has been devastating the fields and flocks for a generation could be something that you slowly lead up to and build up to. They should be able to gather information and find out what this dragon has for a lair, some of the treasure it may have gotten, some of the foes it's defeated. This type of encounter should definitely have a lot more story elements built in, and your story should ultimately lead up into this encounter, because this will be a challenging encounter for most parties to handle. Though it shouldn't be deadly, and the party should be able to overcome this obstacle. Ancient dragons should definitely be the stuff of legends in your game world. Ancient dragons are definitely a high challenge. If you're looking for a monster of the week, I recommend going with an ancient dragon and just starting at a high level of play. Throw the characters right into it. Otherwise, if you're putting this in the story, these should be things that story elements should ultimately climax to. While the adult dragon is definitely a challenge, an ancient is even more so. This is, if you will, the smog of stories. These are things that are hard to get to. The dragons have lived this long for a reason. They know well enough not to constantly attack towns where there's opportunities for them to get hurt and damaged and possibly killed, but they're also strong and brilliant enough to collect massive hordes over a long amount of time and to be known throughout the region. Now, any lower level party who hears tell of an ancient dragon and goes in search of it most likely should be TPK'd. If you've got a low level group of adventurers who first thing they want to do is go to the dragon, give yourself an opportunity to build the story to progress to that level. Otherwise, if you play your dragon correctly, utilizing their abilities, their saving throws, their legendary resistance and actions, their layer effects, there is no way a low-level party should be able to survive an encounter with an ancient dragon. But if you're looking for a dragon to be your ultimate climactic battle, the ancient dragon is the way to go. And again, you can build in story elements that leads you to this climactic battle. Perhaps over time, your characters are just adventuring in another part of the world when strangers come, having heard of the heroes, and petition the heroes to come and save them from a dragon. Much like the events of Dragon Slayer from the 80s really looked for a wizard to come and destroy a dragon in its lair, it's the same type of piece. You could really work that story element in if you've got higher level characters who have been adventuring for a while. You want to change things up. They get petitioned to come in and stop this evil red dragon. This is the type of adventure that really should be a climactic, almost conclusion to your adventuring party. As we continue to get closer and closer to the launch of Fizzbins, thinking about dragons in-game settings in lower level gameplay really allows us to bring Dungeons and Dragons full circle to feature dragons as a prominent aspect of your game world, which should be mythical and fantastic, epic, and ultimately fantastic. Now, next week is when we're going to really kind of put the bow on this series about dragons in preparation for the launch of Fizzbin's Treasury of Dragons. We're going to look at dragons in pop culture and kind of how they not only have differentiations from each other, almost as if different types of dragons existed in the same worlds, even though they're different fantastical beasts, but also how they tie into the story, why they're there, how they got there, the effects they have on the story and the characters. Ultimately, coming up with some good ways for us to think about when we're populating our worlds with dragons, why it makes so much sense to have dragons be a prominent aspect of your game worlds. Can't wait to see you next week as we wrap up this series, look at pop culture dragons, compare them with D&D dragons, and really tie the knot on introducing dragons in your campaign world. Hope you enjoyed the video, and until next week, let us know, where will your adventures take you? I hope you enjoyed that video. Here's a link to another video that you may enjoy. Also, make sure you hit that subscribe button to help us grow. If you'd like to support us, make sure you check out the description of the video with some links, and leave a comment to let us know, where will your adventures take you?